Hi, this is Ms. Holly from Olympian High School. Today I wanted to teach you about some cultural changes that took place during the post-classical period, but in order to learn that, you need to go back to chapter 8, all the way back, because some of you may have skipped ancient world history in 9th grade, and I just want to make sure you understand the basics of two philosophies, Confucianism and Daoism. So I won't go into all the details, but we'll start with Confucianism and then compare and contrast with Daoism. So early Confucianism has its roots in the classical period. It arose during a period when a lot of people were experiencing a period just before a period called the period of the Warring States, where there was a lot of chaos and a lot of fighting in the world. And so people were looking for ways to restore order. How can we best restore order? And a man named Confucius, called Confucius, his real name, is going to come up with some ideas that have to do with having good government officials in power to create stability. So that's sort of the origin of where Confucius' thinking comes from. He himself was an aristocrat. You can read in your book about how he had very strict, high standards, unwilling to compromise. He was looking for a job in the government, and he looked for about a decade looking for a job. He wandered from place to place away from his province, eventually returned home and never getting that bureaucratic job, and then died. But his students that he accumulated, because he had a reputation of being very wise, his disciples are going to gather his teachings in a book called the Analects, and that's how we know about him. Confucius stayed away from things like religion and metaphysics because he felt like you could never really know about those answers to those questions. You could never really know what happened to us when we died, but he focused on the right and wrong way to behave and about how government should look like, politics. He was hoping to cultivate people called Shunza, or superior individuals who could lead the government and restore order to China. Because there was no such thing as schools back then, he taught his students from books that were available at the time, Zhou dynasty books, and that's going to be interesting because it's going to lead to a continuity. People are going to be studying these books all the way up until the early 20th century, until the fall of the Qing dynasty, because that's what people who were trying to get jobs in the government did. They did this civil service exam that was based on Confucian philosophy and Confucian literature. Okay, the next thing we're going to study is the Confucian values, Ren, Li, and Sheo. All of these things culminating in cultivating someone called a Junsa, these ideal leaders. So Ren is roughly translated as benevolence or kindness or your compassion for other humans. Li is propriety or appropriate behavior, and Sheo is filial piety, which is concern for your brothers and your family and behaving right towards your family. There are two major Confucian expounders, the people that talk about Confucian thought you need to know about. Mencius, who focused more on Ren being important. He was sort of dismissed during his lifetime, Ren being benevolence, and Shunza, who focused more on Li, or appropriate behavior, although they were both optimistic because they felt like humans could become better if they had cultivated a certain quality. And as I mentioned, Mencius focused on Ren, and Shunza focused on Li and disciplined self-control. I don't want to get too deep down that rabbit hole. Taoism is sort of the opposite of Confucianism. Confucianism is seen as more like a public pursuit, whereas Taoism rejected these active attempts to change the world and be super involved in politics. Pacifism isn't the perfect word for describing Taoism, but they do reject this more like active approach. And we'll talk about some of their ideas. The founder of Taoism is Lao Tzu. Sometimes it's spelled differently. He wrote the book, The Tao Te Ching, or he and others. We don't know exactly who wrote it, but probably him and some others. And there's another important book for Taoists called the Zhuangzi, named after its author. Some of the ideas you need to know about is the Tao. So Taoists want to be in harmony with nature. So they reject super over intellectual pursuits and esoteric ways of trying to understand reality and lots of education. Instead, they want you to be in harmony with nature. So they talk about the Tao, which is a difficult concept to describe, but it's the way of nature. And, your book likens it to water being soft and yielding, but very capable of eroding even the toughest materials like rocks, or to the empty spot in a pot. Without that empty place in the pot wouldn't work. So it's the idea of having strength in a way that you wouldn't think of having strength. You'll read more about it in your book if you want. So be in harmony with the Tao, that's one idea. And the other idea is Wu Wei. So the idea behind Wu Wei is disengagement. That's a rough way to translate it. That if we try to control the universe too much, it actually causes more chaos rather than less. So we have to disengage, practice Wu Wei. Don't try to get an advanced education. Don't try to be ambitious. Have a simple life in harmony with nature and cultivate introspection and self-knowledge. So people could be both. They could be, as your book describes, Confucian by day and Taoist by night. You didn't have to be exclusively one or the other. So those are just some basics before we start learning chapter 15.